On October 12, 1972, a small chartered aircraft took off from Uruguay, South America, headed for Santiago, Chile. On board were 45 passengers, including rugby players, their families, and friends. The flight was supposed to take just 3 hours, but the plane was about to face a tragic fate. The plane encountered the towering Andes Mountains, the longest mountain range in the world outside of the Himalayas, and the highest point in the Western Hemisphere. These mountains became the backdrop of a horrifying story, one that no one could have predicted. On that fateful day, a storm hit the Andes, making the flight impossible to continue. The pilots decided to make an unscheduled stop in Mendoza, Argentina for the night, hoping for better weather the next day. The next afternoon, the aircraft took off again at 2:18 p.m. and continued for about an hour before approaching the descent into Santiago. However, something went terribly wrong. The plane encountered severe turbulence. The passengers initially didn't take the turbulence seriously. But as the plane descended into a thick mass of clouds, they soon realized something was gravely wrong. The plane was headed straight toward a mountain. The pilots attempted to ascend quickly to avoid the collision, but it was too late. The rear of the aircraft slammed into the mountain. The impact caused the rear section of the plane to break off, and 2 rows of seats flew out of the plane, carrying 3 passengers with it, who were lost forever. Despite the severe damage, the plane continued to climb for a few seconds, but then began its fatal descent. A second collision followed, and the left wing of the aircraft snapped off. Several passengers were thrown from the plane. Finally, the remaining front portion of the plane crashed into a glacier, sliding down at 350 kilometers per hour before it stopped after plummeting 700 meters. Out of the 45 people on board, 33 survived, but many were seriously injured. The crash occurred in an isolated part of the Andes, and the survivors were trapped in a remote location with no immediate hope of rescue. As the survivors assessed their injuries, it became clear that medical assistance was desperately needed. But there was no way to contact anyone. They were stranded in the middle of the Andes Mountains, with nothing but snow and ice surrounding them. The wreckage provided some shelter, but the conditions were brutal. The survivors had to rely on each other to stay alive, and the first priority was to check who was still alive and who could be saved. Among the survivors were 2 medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, who immediately began to care for the injured passengers. Fernando Parado, who had suffered a severe skull fracture, remained in a coma for hours. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Chilean authorities had been alerted about the crash, and 4 aircraft were deployed to search for the wreckage. However, because the aircraft was white and surrounded by white snow, it was nearly impossible to spot. The search efforts went on through the night, but by the end of the first day, nothing was found. As the survivors huddled together in the wreckage, their initial hope began to fade. They had no food, no water, and the severe cold was a constant threat. The night of October 13th, 5 of the injured passengers didn't survive, reducing the number of survivors to 28. They used luggage, seats, and snow to close off parts of the wreckage and create a makeshift shelter. But despite these efforts, their food and water ran out quickly. The next morning, the survivors tried writing SOS on the roof of the plane using lipstick, but they soon realized they didn't have enough to finish the word. They then attempted to use suitcases to form a giant cross in the snow, hoping that any search aircraft flying over would spot it. 3 planes flew over the wreckage, but none saw the survivors' signals. The survivors' hope was beginning to wane. By October 15th, the survivors realized they were running out of time and resources. Their primary concern was finding food and water. Fido Strach, one of the survivors, managed to find a way to gather water by using a metal sheet to collect solar rays and melt the snow, collecting the water in empty wine bottles. Meanwhile, many of the survivors used the wool from seat cushions to protect themselves from the extreme cold. But their situation was growing increasingly dire. The survivors were becoming weak, and their stamina was running out. Fernando Parrado was still in a coma when he was found by the other survivors. When he regained consciousness, he learned that his mother had died in the crash and his 19-year-old sister was seriously injured. Parrado did everything he could to keep his sister alive, but after 8 days, she too succumbed to her injuries. With the cold biting through their bones and the food running low, the survivors made an unimaginable choice. On October 29th, after 16 days in the wreckage, the survivors faced a harrowing decision: cannibalism. Desperate to survive, they began to consume the bodies of the deceased passengers. This was not a choice they took lightly, but the desperation of their situation left them with no other options. By November 15th, after more than a month of survival, the decision was made to leave the wreckage site and search for help. Canessa, Parrado, and Vizintin set off towards the mountains, believing that they would find a nearby town. They had no map, no climbing gear, and no clear direction, but they had no choice but to keep moving. For 3 days, the trio climbed over snow-covered terrain without any real success. However, they did find the tail section of the plane. Inside it, they found some survival supplies, chocolates, clothes, and a radio system that they hoped would help them call for help. They attempted to get the radio working, but they found that the batteries were incompatible with the aircraft's system. This delay forced them to keep walking, hoping that they were heading in the right direction. On December 12th, after more than 2 months of struggling through the unforgiving Andes, Parrado and Canessa reached a valley where they saw cows grazing. The sight of these animals was a huge relief for the exhausted duo. As they tried to cross the river, they saw 3 men on horseback on the other side.